What's up, sports fans? This is the Lucas Ross Sports Channel. We continue with our 2025 college football schedule preview and very early projected record series. The Iowa Hawkeyes are up next. Before we look ahead to 2025, let's take a look back at what Iowa did in 2024. Here are my projections and predictions last year for Iowa. My projection for them was 9-3, and then my prediction for them also was 9-3. But Iowa was just a little bit of a game under that. They went 8-4 last year, so I was just one game ahead of getting their actual prediction and projection right. But this team went 8-4 last year. But overall, if you count their bowl game victory at the end of the season, this team finished with an overall record at 8-5. So not a bad season for Iowa. You kind of expect this team to be right there around 8 or 9 wins, or maybe 10 wins at best as well. Maybe even 7. But the schedule last year, and also with the newcomers in the Big Ten, it did make the schedule a little bit tougher compared to last year, or maybe the year before, I should say. You look at this schedule from 2024. First off, you look at who they played in the non-conference. They played Illinois State, Iowa State, and then they also played Troy. So they, of course, had to play the Big 12 of Iowa State. They play them every year because of that rivalry. And, of course, they ended up losing here to home to the Cyclones. And Iowa State ended up being a really good team last year, and they were the runner-ups in the Big 12 championship. So, yeah, that was a tough game there, especially losing at home to the Cyclones. And I talked about this rivalry going back and forth. It seems like the away team always wins this game every year, and that's how really close the rivalry has been now for the last few years. But then you look at Iowa's Big Ten schedule last year. First off, you look at their home games. They had Washington, Northwestern, Wisconsin, and Nebraska. So a pretty easy home schedule. They beat Washington, Northwestern, Wisconsin, and Nebraska. So they won all their home games last year in the Big Ten. Then you look at their road schedule. They played Minnesota, Ohio State, Michigan State, and UCLA and Maryland. So they lost to Ohio State, Michigan State, and UCLA. I think Michigan State and UCLA are kind of disappointing losses here for Iowa because they were much better teams compared to those two teams, but they ended up losing to both of them on the road. And then obviously Ohio State was their big tough test, especially on the road. So yeah, this schedule was a little bit tough last year, but it really wasn't quite as bad as I think it is this year in 2025. You look at the schedule coming up for 2025 for the Hawkeyes. Before we go game by game, let's take a look at who Iowa plays in the non-conference for this season. So you look at their non-conference schedule, they will play UAlbany, an FCS team, and then they, of course, play on the road here at Iowa State. And they will play them in week 2 like they always do every year. And they play this game every single year, it seems like, because it's a rivalry and everything. Yeah, Iowa State, that game will be on the road. That's going to be pretty extremely tough there, especially playing that game on the road. But like I mentioned, this rivalry goes back and forth. It seems like the away team always wins this game, so it probably wouldn't be a big shock here if Iowa did end up beating Iowa State here on the road. But I think, it's going to be a pretty competitive game. We'll see what happens here, like it always is. And then you got UMass as well, so non-conference schedule pretty similar to last year. You got that big game against Iowa State, and then you got a couple of cupcake games here in UAlbany, FCS team, and then you got UMass out of the group of 5. So that's your non-conference schedule. Let's now look at the home schedule in the Big Ten. They will play 5 home games in the Big Ten this year. They'll play Indiana, Penn State, Minnesota, Oregon, and Michigan State. So you got 3 big games in there: Indiana, Penn State, and Oregon. Penn State and Oregon are really talented teams, but you get these 2 teams at home this year, 2 teams that win, of course, to the Big Ten championship. It does give Iowa a chance to probably win one of these 2 games and probably pull off the upset, but those are going to be pretty tough games, even though it's at home here for the Hawkeyes. And then obviously Indiana was a really big surprise team last year. That's going to be another tough game as well. And then Minnesota and Michigan State, 2 winnable games here for Iowa. The Michigan State game, of course, will be a revenge game here for the Hawkeyes. And then Minnesota, that's always a pretty well-coached team. They're probably going to want to run the football. This is kind of like a game that could come down to like both defensive teams. So yeah, that's your home schedule. It's a pretty tough home schedule when you got Penn State, Oregon, and Indiana here all at home. But yeah, 5 home games here in the Big Ten. That's really favorable here for Iowa. And then you take a look at the road schedule. They'll play 4 away games in the Big Ten. They'll play at Rutgers, at Wisconsin, at USC, and then at Nebraska. So This is kind of a tough road schedule. Wisconsin, USC, and Nebraska, always really tough places to play. Wisconsin wasn't really good last year. USC was about pretty average. Nebraska also about pretty average as well. But these are all games that really are on the road, and they're not going to be pretty easy games here for Iowa. Rutgers, obviously a pretty winnable game, but, the Scarlet Knights, they're a program that's kind of been heading in the right direction as of late. So, yeah, that's your away schedule. Let's now go back to the schedule here and go full game by game now for the Hawkeyes. Again, they'll start things off with Albany on August 30th, and then they play on the road at Iowa State on September the 6th. Then you got UMass here after that on September the 13th. So you play 3 non-conference games, so there's a pretty good chance here that Iowa could probably start out 2-1 or maybe 3-0, depending on what happens in that Iowa State game. But then after that, they'll open up Big Ten play against Rutgers on September 20th. Then they play Indiana at home on September 27th. And then they get a bye week here right before playing Wisconsin on the road on October the 11th. I kind of rather have the bye week right before playing Penn State the next weekend. Because what if Iowa kind of looks ahead, over ahead of Wisconsin, and they probably look ahead to next week? Yeah, that might ruin their chances to probably ruin an undefeated season. If they probably start 5-0, if they probably were to beat Rutgers and Indiana, they could probably start 5-0, and then they could probably slip up here against Wisconsin because they might look ahead to next week. But yeah, they'll play Penn State at home on October the 18th, and then they play Minnesota at home as well on October the 25th, and then they get a bye week here. This is actually a better spot for a bye week. They get a bye week before playing Oregon at home on November 8th. So how about this, though? From October 18th to November 8th, they're going to be playing 3 games in a row at home. Yeah, that does give them a chance here to probably pull off some couple of big upsets. I think at best they can probably win one of these 2 games against Penn State or Oregon. But yeah, Penn State, you kind of rather have the bye week against them. But the good news is you get a bye week here before playing Oregon. I think that's a really good spot for a bye week. And then you got USC on the road here on November 15th. And then you come back at home here against Michigan State on November 22nd. And then you close things out on a Friday night at Nebraska on November 28th. So that is the schedule for Iowa for 2025. Again, a pretty tough schedule when you got Oregon and Penn State both on the schedule, but the good news is what's making this schedule from getting even tougher is the fact that they get both Oregon and Penn State at home. So, yeah, a couple of games on here where I think Iowa can probably have a chance to probably pull off the upset either way. It should be 2 really good physical games. So let's now get at the projection here for Iowa. This is the scale I'll be using here for their projection. Basically, if it's a 1% game in the red, that's pretty much counted as an automatic loss in that percentage. And then your 20% games in the orange, those are games where Iowa would be like a double-digit underdog. 40% games in the yellow, they'll be a clear underdog in that percentage by 6 or 7 points, so by about a touchdown. Somewhere in that point range, and then your 50-50 games will stay in the white, games that really could go either way. 60% games in the purple, those are games where Iowa will be favored by about a touchdown, 6 or 7 points, somewhere in that point range. And then your 80% games in the blue, those are games where Iowa would be favored by double digits. And then your green games, your automatic wins are your 99% games in the green. So we start with a couple of wins here for Iowa. I think you got a couple of them, like I mentioned, Albany and UMass. I think you can count those as wins already here for the Hawkeyes. They're not guaranteed wins, and I know we've seen Iowa struggle against these non-conference opponents in the past, but I really don't expect them to lose these 2 games. These are 2 games that they definitely should be able to win, and I think they'll be favored in both of them by like 20-plus points. I think both of these games are definitely over that 95 to 99% mark because, Albany is an FCS team, and UMass is not really a group of 5 team that is really going to be any kind of trouble here for Iowa this year in 2025. So I think those 2 games are pretty much your automatic wins, and then you look at the rest of the schedule. I don't think you got any games on here where I think the Hawkeyes will be favored by double digits, but I got one game on here in the purple where I think they'll be favored by 6 or 7 points, and that's going to be Michigan State here on November 22nd. I get it, Michigan State beat Iowa last year. That's pretty much the reason why it turned into a purple game instead of like a blue game. If Iowa had beaten Michigan State last year, that probably would be a blue game there for the Hawkeyes, but because Michigan State beat them last year, that's the reason why it turns into a purple game. And also, I think Iowa playing at home, that does favor them, so that's the reason why I'm kind of favoring them here by a touchdown against Michigan State by 6 or 7 points. But you never know. Michigan State could be a program that's looking like it's heading in the right direction. Last year they were 5-7. You never know about these second-year head coaches with their programs. They can obviously turn things around in a heartbeat. So, yeah, you probably don't want to sleep on that game if you're Iowa because you lost to the Spartans last year. And then we got a couple of games on here where I think Iowa will be a clear underdog, by 40%, like, 6 or 7 points, somewhere in that particular range. They're not in the red or the orange, though. Like I said, they'll be probably underdogs by a touchdown in both of these games. And those are your two big games, Penn State and Oregon. Like I said, I don't really think they should have a bye week here before playing Wisconsin. You'd rather have the bye week before playing Penn State. But at least they get a bye week before playing the Ducks, which I think is really good news here if you're Iowa. It does give you a chance to kind of prepare for Oregon and see what they're like. And that probably does give you a chance here to pull off the upset. So, yeah, Penn State and Oregon will be tough games. But I think playing at home, that's the reason why they both turn out to be like in the yellow. I think they'll be like clear underdogs in both of those games by 6 or 7 points. So by about a touchdown. Penn State and Oregon are definitely more talented than Iowa is, but again, playing at home, it's always a pretty tough place to play at Iowa. So I think the Hawkeyes will be 6 or 7 point underdogs in both of those games. And then that leaves you with 7 total 50-50 games. You got Iowa State, Rutgers, Indiana, Wisconsin, Minnesota, USC, and Nebraska. These are all games that really can go either way. Obviously, Iowa State's a rivalry. That, of course, is going to be pretty close every year. Rutgers, obviously, because it's on the road, that's the reason why it's a 50-50 game. Same thing with Wisconsin, and then same thing with USC and Nebraska. Indiana, I don't know how good Indiana is going to be this year. We'll see if they're not really maybe they're not as good as they were last year, but still, with Kirk-Cinetti, what he did last year, I think we're kind of expecting them to still be a well-coached team, and they've already provided enough players in the transfer portal. And I obviously think Minnesota is a pretty even matchup. When you compare to both teams, these are teams that like to run the football, and they also are just really physical on the defensive side of the football. So that might be a game that really comes down to whoever has the better defense. So when you look at the schedule, what does the projected record come out to be here for Iowa? Well, let's say they split these 50-50 games, but first off, we count the green games as wins, and then you average out that one purple game at 60%, then average out a couple of these yellow games at 40%, and then average out all 7 of these 50-50 games at 50%. And let's say they probably win 4 out of the 7, and then you probably slip up maybe against Michigan State. The odds would say they probably lose 3 50-50 games, and then they probably win like 4 50-50 games, and then they could probably slip up against Michigan State. So that'll probably give you 4 more losses, and then they obviously are going to be underdogs against either Penn State and Oregon. But maybe they win one of those yellow games, and that does give them a projection of 7-5. So I think that's a pretty fair projection for Iowa. When you look at this schedule, they will be underdogs against Penn State and Oregon, but maybe they pull off an upset right there against one of those two teams. It wouldn't shock me, to be honest, if they were to pull off the upset. What would shock me is they probably beat both of those teams, but I don't think that's going to happen. Maybe they pull off an upset against one of those two teams, and then they probably lose the other team, but they could probably slip up against Michigan State as well. You never know. Michigan State beat them last year, and that's the reason why it's in the purple. That's a game that's going to be a trap game, even though it's at home here for the Hawkeyes. And yeah, I think 8-4 probably the best case scenario, and then worst case probably still making it to a bowl game at 6-6. If Iowa does worse than that though, like 5-7 or 4-8, yeah, it would be a disappointing year for the Hawkeyes for 2025. But that is my projection here for Iowa for 2025 is 7-5. Do you guys agree or disagree? And also give me your thoughts about Iowa's schedule down in the comments below. Is it tough or not so tough? Thanks for watching this video, and stay tuned for more sports content videos on my Lucas Ross Sports YouTube channel.